At the surgery, the household dogs surged around me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with the dull eyes and, when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing around him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. When the doctor reached at his surgery at the hospital, he did not have medicinal treatment, but he kept the little dog in the company of other dogs. Other dogs smelled him and, finding him an uninteresting object, left him alone. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For few days I kept for 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in yard. Now doctor prepared a bed for him in a warm loose box in the room of other dogs. He didn't give him food for 2 days, only gave him plenty of water. From the second day he felt a little good, and from third day he started whimper when he heard the voice of other dogs. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joy and Greyhound and his friends, all rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him. The dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. The doctor opened the door. The other dogs rolled over him. Like Joy and Greyhound, they became his friends. They lolled over him and went to the garden. Tricky followed them with his extra surplus fat. Extra means surplus fat. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was the usual headlong rush followed by the sounds of high speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of the meal. And on the same day, the doctor was present at the feeding time. He was observing the dogs. They were running to finish the meal kept for them. Tricky was unable to compete with these dogs. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way toward it. When they finished their food, Tricky went toward it. He licked the shiny bowls. Next day, an extra bowl kept for him. He ran toward it happily. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. He discovered the joy of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an expected member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at meal times and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. Now, the doctor did not have medicinal treatment. He kept the dog with the other dogs. Tricky ran about with the dogs and did many exercise as they did, and so that his progress was rapid. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, drilling a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. I dodged the question about whether his cushion were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. Mrs. Pumphrey rang doctor a dozen times a day for his latest news. He always answered his health was improving, convulsing rapidly means it's improving rapidly. The word convulsing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs, each for breakfast. But when the bottle of wine began to arrive, the real possibility of situation began to dawn on the household. The word convulsing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. Means after hearing that his dog was improving, he is now good in his health, Mrs. Pumphrey started sending fresh eggs, a bottle of wine, brandy every day for Tricky. The doctor and his partner had good days now. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. Now, these all things were to enrich Tricky's blood, but it became an occasional treat for the doctor and his friends. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. Now, they started enjoying all these things. They were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with brandy. At and In those days, doctor and his partner, they used to take eggs in the morning and wine in the midday meal, and they finished their day with brandy sitting near the uh, fire. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collections. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on a permanent guest, but the doctor made a call to Mrs. Pumphrey and called, told her that the little dog had recovered and she might collect him. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeurs opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" "Yes, he is fine. There is no need for you to get out of the car. I will go and fetch him." Now, within few minutes, Mrs. Pumphrey arrived, and the doctor bring out the dog. Mrs. Pumphrey asked that to tell her the truth whether her dog was okay or not. Then doctor answered, Tricky was good now. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ear flapping, tail waving, and was the little dog, golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks he had been transformed into a lithe, hard muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in the great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. The doctor walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dog means a group of dog playing round and round in the lawn, and among them the golden figure of Tricky was appeared. Within 2 weeks he was transformed into a hard muscled animal. He used to play with dogs, he does lots of exercise with them. I carried him back along the passage to front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in tremendous leap and seated into Mr. sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "oh" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed her, licking her face and baking, barking. The doctor brought him near his mistress. When the dog saw her, he jumped from the doctor's arm and went into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. He licked her face and started barking. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the bed toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes, her lips trembled. "Oh, Mrs. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." The doctor helped the servant of Mrs. Pumphrey to brought the dog's accessories. None of them had been used. She was so grateful and happy to see her dog healthy again. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey said, "Oh, Mrs. Harriet, Mr. Harriet, how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." That's all for today.